Have you ever wondered why a simple bowl of cornmeal mush with a poached egg felt like a royal banquet in 1975? Or why we never threw away a single crust of stale bread? Today, the world is obsessed with expensive, plastic-tasting delivery food, but in the 1970s, we had no money, and we ate 25 incredible meals that nobody seems to make anymore. I am 65 years old, and I miss every single one of them. Today, I am opening Grandma Benny's notebook to bring back the flavors that kept our souls alive when our pockets were empty. The 1970s were not kind to families like ours. My father worked at the mill, and inflation ate through his paycheck like rust through sheet metal. I remember him coming home with less money each week, his shirt collar darkened with sweat, his face already worried about the next bill. The house on Chestnut Street was cramped with 7 children, 2 grandmothers, and whatever relatives needed shelter that month. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, and the yellowed linoleum floors creaked under the weight of so many feet. We never called ourselves poor. We simply knew that waste was a sin, that every grain of rice had a story, that a single potato could feed a family if you knew the right way to coax it. Grandma Benny kept that knowledge in her notebook, the one with grease stains on nearly every page, the margins filled with her cramped handwriting, underlined phrases that had saved our lives more times than I could count. That notebook was our survival manual, our encyclopedia of miracles. She would open it after midnight when sleep wouldn't come, and I would see her thick fingers tracing recipes that turned nothing into something, emptiness into sustenance. She never consulted cookbooks like modern people do with their glowing screens. She consulted her own hands, her own memories, the ingredients that cost pennies or nothing at all. The economy of 1973 through 1979 was a pressure cooker that never stopped hissing. We felt it in our bones, in the way my mother rationed the butter, in the way eggs became precious, in the way we learned to eat things that the neighbors threw away. The cost of living doubled between my 13th and 20th birthdays. I watched my parents' faces grow thinner, even as they insisted we children eat more. The house was always cold in winter because heating oil cost more than prayers could fix. We gathered in the kitchen around the black iron stove, and that room became our entire world during those months. The kitchen was where Grandma Benny performed her alchemy, where she taught us that deprivation was not a curse, but an education. She never spoke about money. She spoke about technique, about timing, about the moment when fat reaches its perfect temperature, when custard is ready to come off the heat, when bread has risen to its peak. The notebook grew thicker over those years, its pages warped from steam, from the moisture of a room where cooking never stopped. Every recipe in that book was born from a moment when we had nothing left but our wits and our hands and the strange wisdom that comes from watching every grain of food disappear into hungry mouths. I can still see Grandma Benny's hands moving through that kitchen as though it were yesterday instead of 50 years ago. Her wedding ring had worn thin from decades of work, and her knuckles were swollen with arthritis. But those hands knew things that culinary schools could never teach. She would stand before the stove at 5 in the morning before anyone else was awake, and she would begin the work that would feed all of us through another day. The pressure cooker sat on the back burner like a piece of household mythology, its weight solid and immovable, its pressure gauge pointing toward temperatures that seemed impossible. She trusted that pot with her life, and we trusted her. Every meal that came from that kitchen was a negotiation between what we had and what we needed, and somehow she always found the balance. The notebook was her map, but her hands were the real compass. Let me tell you about the first meal I learned to understand not just as food but as philosophy. Cornmeal mush with a poached egg was our Monday breakfast, and it was born from the fact that cornmeal cost almost nothing, that eggs came from the neighbors' chickens, and that we had cream that was turning toward butter anyway. Grandma Benny would pour cornmeal into boiling water with the confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, and the smell would fill the entire house. Not unpleasant, but thick and ancient, the smell of survival itself. She would stir it constantly with a heavy wooden spoon, and I can still hear the sound of it against the bottom of the pot, that rhythmic scraping that meant food was coming. The cornmeal would thicken until it became almost solid, and then she would pour it into a buttered cast iron skillet, where it would set into a golden cake. When it cooled and firmed, she would slice it into portions, and each piece would go into the skillet with a hiss of hot butter. The sound of cornmeal hitting hot fat is something you do not forget. It snaps and crackles like tiny fireworks, and the smell becomes something completely different, deeper, more complex, almost toasted. And then she would crack an egg into the center of that golden square, and the yolk would shimmer in the heat, the white turning opaque around it. That egg was not just protein. That egg was love, was care, was the knowledge that breakfast mattered because it had to sustain us through a day of physical work. We would eat it with a fork, cutting through the crispy exterior of the mush to the soft interior, and the yolk would break across it like a liquid golden sun. No restaurant has ever served me anything that tasted the way that simple bowl of cornmeal and egg tasted to me in 1974. The second meal was even simpler but somehow more profound. Bread with butter and cream was not something we made on good days. It was something we made on days when there was literally nothing else. Grandma Benny would bring out yesterday's loaf, and if it was already stale, that was better. She would slice it thick, almost a half-inch, and place each piece on a buttered cast iron griddle where it would toast slowly until the edges turned golden brown. While the bread toasted, she would pour heavy cream into a small bowl, and if we had sugar, she would whip it with a fork, vigorous, rhythmic beating that went on for several minutes until the cream thickened and became nearly solid, the fork leaving tracks through it. But often we had no sugar, no time, no energy for whipping. She would simply brush the warm toast with softened butter, thick enough that it pooled in the indentations of the bread, and then she would pour plain cream over it, or sometimes sour cream if that was what we had. The combination of warm toasted bread, melted butter, and cold sour cream created a texture that was almost impossible to describe. The bread remained sturdy enough to hold together, but became tender inside, soaked through with fat and cream. There was something medieval about this meal, something that connected us to centuries of people who had learned to turn grain and milk into comfort. We would eat it standing up in the kitchen, dripping cream onto our plates, and it was enough. Not fancy, not restaurant food, but enough. The third meal that lives in my memory is Jell-O salad, and I know what people think about Jell-O salads now. They think it is kitsch, that it was a sign of bad taste, that nobody with any sense would make them. But those people did not grow up in 1975. Jell-O was magic. It was technology. It was color and shine and something that seemed impossible to create at home. And yet there it was, wobbling on the table, catching the light. Grandma Benny would buy the packet of Jell-O in whatever color was cheapest that week, lime green, orange, bright red, and she would dissolve it in boiling water, and then she would fold into it whatever we had. Sometimes it was canned fruit cocktail, those pale pieces of peach and pear suspended in syrup. Sometimes it was cottage cheese, creating a dense, studded mass that held the light differently. Sometimes she would layer different colors, creating a mosaic that took hours to set, and we would peer into the refrigerator every 20 minutes to watch it transform from liquid chaos into a shimmering structure. The beauty of it was in its impermanence, in the fact that it would eventually melt, that it was not meant to last. But while it lasted, it was magnificent. The gelatin would catch on the fork with a subtle resistance, then give way, and the sweetness would bloom on the tongue. And for a moment, we were no longer eating the cheapest possible food. We were eating jewelry. Homemade marshmallows came into my life in the winter of 1976, when my youngest brother was sick and nothing seemed to comfort him. Grandma Benny decided that what he needed was something light, something that would dissolve on his tongue like a cloud. She did not have a recipe. She had hands that remembered, and a notebook full of marginal notes. She whipped egg whites with a fork in a tin bowl, vigorous, endless beating that made her shoulders ache, and she told me later that she could feel her own strength flowing into those whites, turning them from liquid to foam. It took nearly 30 minutes of beating, and my arms hurt just watching her do it. When they had reached their peak, she folded in gelatin she had bloomed in cold water, and powdered sugar and vanilla if we had it. She spread the mixture into a pan lined with parchment, and then it sat overnight, and when we cut it the next morning it was like cutting clouds. The outside was dusted with more powdered sugar, and the inside was tender, almost dissolving. My brother ate 3 of them and fell asleep smiling. That meal taught me that nourishment is not just about calories. It is about tenderness, about the willingness to spend time and effort on something that exists only to be beautiful for a moment. Bread soup was something Grandma Benny made in desperate times, and I remember the first time she served it to me, I almost cried. It was bread, yesterday's bread, the crusts included, torn into small pieces and put into a pot with broth that she had made from nothing, or from bone, or from the water that vegetables had cooked in. She would warm milk separately, and then pour both the broth and the milk into the bread, and the bread would soften, almost disintegrate, becoming something between soup and porridge. A pinch of salt, sometimes a pinch of sugar, sometimes just the bread and the milk and the broth, becoming one thing. The spoon would sink into it easily, and it had the consistency of something being digested before you even swallowed it. It required no teeth, no effort, and there was something deeply comforting about that. It was the meal of the very poor and the very old, and Grandma Benny would make it on days when she had nothing else, and we would eat it and be full. The steam from the bowl would rise to the ceiling and condense on the windows in small rivulets, and I would watch those patterns while I ate, and think about how many people before us had eaten exactly this meal, had watched the same steam rise and fall.